reduce the background noise. And also, please respect our speakers' opinions. If you don't agree, you can ask during the Q&A session. You can ask a respectful question and address it there. And understand that our speakers' opinions don't necessarily reflect those of XR Women as an organization or members of our team. But we do want you to make connections with other people so you can find partners, collaborators, supporters, and just in general, make the future better for everyone through technology. We are grateful to our sponsors, the people who help our volunteer team make this happen for more than 250 events for 5.5 years. We have been putting on these events, and the generous members of our team have donated their time to make this happen, and Engage has allowed us to have this gorgeous space in which to hold our sessions. So we are grateful to them, and we are especially grateful to Drs. Mary E. Hawksworth and Philip A. Alperson for their financial support of XR Women. XR Women is going to be at AWE again. Yes, I am so excited. It's all about AWE right now. We will be presenting our 6th annual awards there on stage in the Expo Hall. That's going to be on Wednesday, June 17th from 4 to 5 p.m. If any of you have attended in previous years, it should be in the same place. The location might change slightly, but it's always a fun occasion, very exciting and emotional and fun. So hope you'll join us there. And then we're also going to do a roundtable on the Thursday morning of June 18th, 10 to 11 a.m. Local time, and we hope you'll join us for that. We'll be sending out more information about that, and we don't have details to share yet, but we are also organizing. Jenna Watts is working on this to organize a coffee meetup at a local coffee shop on one of the mornings before the event, and we'll be providing some pastries and things for folks to come and hang out and meet new people and chat that day. So watch for information about all those activities. We are also looking for sponsorship to help make it possible for us to put on this award ceremony and to get our team to AWE. We are offering acknowledgments during the ceremony at the levels that are listed here on the screen. Please reach out to me at Karen@xrwomen.com if you are interested in supporting, or if you have a suggestion for a company, an organization, or an individual who you think might be willing to support the excellent work that we do here. We are so proud of our 2026 Ringling College graduates. So the officers of our student team at Ringling who have just graduated include Vita Villanueva, Elena Smith, Haisu Ko, and Yushwan Linda He. They're extraordinarily talented, and we have really seen them grow over the past year. They did a showcase in Frame a couple of weeks ago. It's at framevr.io/XR Women Learn. And there you can see a showcase not just of their work, but of other students who participated in the chapter there. It's really well done. They are just incredibly talented, and I'm so proud of them. And I encourage you to hop in and check it out. All you have to do is enter the URL and to hop in there, and then you can see examples of their work. It's a lot of fun. So Sarah Barker is a member of our community and who built the research library in Frame. That's at XR Women Research, framevr.io XR Women Research. is doing a study on women in XR. Now, this is an IRB-approved research, but she is looking for participants. You can see her address there on the screen, and I apologize. Something's changed on the aspect ratio here on the screen, but you can see her address there at the end, sabarker@fielding.edu, if you're interested in participating, and there are options for shorter and longer sessions. So Sarah is here. She's seated in the front row. She's got on a purple blouse, a skirt, and glasses. If you want to talk to her after later, I'm sure she can provide you with some more details. And we currently have a show up in the XR Women Museum, which is also in Frame, framevr.io/XR Women Museum. It's an incredible show with 15 different artists from, I believe, all inhabited continents, and there's interactive work. It's really pretty impressive, and so I strongly encourage you to visit and interact with the works that are on display there when you have time, and come back. You know, you can come back anytime you want. So pop in for a few minutes, visit it, come back another time and see some more of the pieces. That show is curated by our museum director, Paige Dansinger, and Paige is accepting submissions now for the next exhibition, which is going to be called Garden in Full Bloom. And she wants to hear about what you are growing right now. The submission deadline for this is June 1st. Paige, there is, you can reach her at museum@xrwomen.com if you have questions about what sort of things she's looking for. There's also a QR code if you happen to be able to access that. I know if you're in a headset, it's not much help, but and reach out to me too if you need help reaching Paige about this. And also, speaking of Paige, so she has been organizing workout sessions. We have a channel in our Slack called Activities and Games, and we've been organizing Thursday night opportunities to just get together casually and hang out, go play games, and sometimes we do walkabout mini golf, but Paige has been also hosting these workout sessions, and you too can organize something. It doesn't have to be on that Thursday night, it could be any time, but that channel is a great place to go to connect with other people and suggest an activity or game that you could do with others. It's a good way to get to know people better. Next week, we are going to be partnering with Sense AI Hackademy, who put on the Worlds in Action hackathon in March, and they're having another one in July. The first one was in the Bay Area in California. This one is going to be in the Los Angeles area. And we are partnering with them to showcase the work of a team who won the Best Filmmaking, Entertainment, and Simulation at Prize. And that team includes Linda He, who is one of those graduating seniors from Ringling. So we're going to hear a little bit about the hackathon, but we'll also hear about this project and their process and how they came about to win this prize. That's next Wednesday, and that is going to be in Frame also. That's in our events space, so it's framevr.io, XR Women Events. Hope you'll join us. And that brings me to today, and to our speaker, our guest speaker for today, Bree McEwan. And I'm going to stop sharing here so she can bring up her slides while I tell you a little bit about her. So Bree is very impressive. She's a professor at the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at the University of Toronto, and an associate director of the Data Sciences Institute there, a faculty affiliate of the Schwartz-Reitzman Institute for Technology and Society, and she's also a co-founder of the prestigious Questioning Reality Conference, which serves as a social VR research incubator. A lot of really interesting things go on there. She's the author of Navigating New Media Networks, and she co-authored a book called Interpersonal Encounters. Her lab, the McEwan Mediated Communication Lab, focuses on social interaction in VR and the development of online communities. She also has meta-science interests focused on transparency and replication in the social sciences. And I think you will see some of that in her talk today. She's going to talk a little bit about the issue of replication as it applies specifically to VR. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Bree. We're so excited to have you here. Everybody join me in welcoming Bree McEwan.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Can everyone hear me? I don't know if the spatial sound is still on or we're good? Okay. I'm going to just kind of come over here so I can see the clock. And there's a lot jam-packed into this talk, so I'm going to try to be mindful of time as we go. But Karen started me out with a really great introduction, and so I almost don't need... Oh, come on. Got to advance the slides. One second.
Yeah, I think tapping on the right-hand side usually works for me there. Okay, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm just going to have to go with the menu when I need to change a slide, but that's fine. Yeah, so Karen gave me a great introduction, so I almost don't need this slide, but I did start out my career as an interpersonal scholar. And so my interests are always in the way that people interact socially in mediated channels. And I took that from just sort of studying the way people communicate face-to-face to thinking through the way people communicate using social network sites. And then around 2017, 2018, I started getting interested in augmented reality as a potential communication channel, which led into VR. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit, it was like, oh, well, we will be studying people, in spaces where they can't breathe on each other. And we started teaching in VR. And then I moved up to Toronto, where I established the lab. So that's a couple of my students playing with some of our tools in the lab. As Karen mentioned, I took on the Questioning Reality project, which is about bringing social science into AR and VR research and thinking through what are the projects related to social interaction. And then we will have the publisher just sent me that image yesterday, but we will have a book on this topic coming out in October. So this wasn't meant to be, the first of the book promo tour, but here it is. And so these are things that I think about a lot. I'm not an engineer. I'm a social scientist. So I think about the ways that we can make meetings like this better, and the ways that people can actually engage with each other in communication processes in social VR. So, nope, that's exit. Okay, just gonna have to do it this way. So it's not that social sciences aren't involved in social VR. They certainly are, and I know these are really tiny, but we've been doing we've been working on pulling together a lot of articles for a systematic review. And when we look at social VR publications, there's 11% computer science, engineering's at 7%, common media is there at 11%. There's a lot of psychology and neuroscience. So we definitely are social sciences thinking about the way that people use social VR in different ways. And I think that social science has the potential to add a lot to our social VR engagement in these following, it should be 4, I don't know why it says 5 at the bottom, thanks Google Slides, but in these following ways, right? One is being able to manipulate variables in new ways, right? We can do studies now that we couldn't do before to examine social interaction. Like we couldn't, just change your, body real quick, or even some simple ones. I want to do a study where we just change the layout of a table. And we can do that very quickly in a VR setting where it would take more time to move things around physically in a physical real life setting. We hopefully will provide insight into the way that communicators make meaning in social VR, and hopefully that will also influence the design of environments. How do we change things? Changes the way we make meaning. And I think, on the industry side, understanding social science and social VR will help with future adoption. Because right now it sometimes seems we miss some communication processes that are fundamental to people wanting to engage with these technologies, and then wonder why it's not taking off as exactly the way we want. So in terms of manipulating variables in new ways, I have an example or two from our lab. So we've been working on creating some stimuli that we're going to use in the upcoming year, thinking about nonverbals. And of course, when you're in a setting like Engage, and I've taught a lot in Engage, it can be really hard to sort of read the room. Like in this situation, or when I'm teaching a class, there's almost no reading the room here, right? Like no one's moving. I think maybe could you all nod your heads? Okay, so there's like some minor interaction there of like, yes, you're listening, you're out there. I'm not just sort of like talking to a wall as a puppet, right? And so that got me sort of interested in how do people understand each other, and what if we could manipulate emotional expression. And so then there's many people working on this, right? And you get all kinds of Gaussian splats of facial expressions, and can you like have your real face on an avatar, or is it better to be this? And so we actually did a deep dive into the social science of nonverbals, and we pulled out Ekman's facial action coding sequence. We've got 4 of the main emotions here, and we're working on some more. But I also had a student, so I had a computer science student working on this, and then I had one of my social science students went through the literature and found some studies on what's actually useful, right, in terms of people like being able to make sense of emotions. And she came up with some really good research that suggests you don't want too much facial complexity. You don't want to hit the uncanny valley of your own personal face maybe doing weird things. And so for future studies, we've developed these little sprites that we're going to use to let people manipulate their emotional expression and figure out how that might change the human communication. But it means that we don't necessarily have to wait for Gaussian splats to be perfect to get into being able to have nonverbal in social VR, which will help us to engage with each other. And then thinking through some of the ways that we measure these things, a lot of my work actually starts off in how do we measure things. There's arguments in the VR literature that we should never have perceptual measures. We shouldn't use pen and paper measures, the sort of Likert scale, asking people what they think. There's always measurement error. To which I say we shouldn't use bad measures. We shouldn't use bad Likert measures. But sometimes when we want to know about people's perceptions of a technology, we need to measure their perceptions. And if I, go back for a second, when I'm thinking about a flight simulator, sure, I don't need the entire skyline of Sydney to be perfectly rendered. I don't need to know how the pilot felt about the environment. I just need to know how quickly they can push the buttons and if it makes sense based on what they'd be experiencing physically. But if I'm thinking about things like, perceived physical fidelity, which is a study we've been working on, which is how much does a space sort of tap into the cognitive heuristics that you already have. And so the fascinating thing about VR is it could be anything, right? Like this physical space exists somewhere that we're in right now, but it exists in Korea. And I don't think many of us are currently, given the time, I don't think many of us are currently in Korea, but we can experience it, right? But it also taps into heuristics that we have, right? You knew, even if you hadn't been here before, that this is a stage and the speaker's going to be on stage. And you're supposed to sit there and you're going to stare this way and you're going to listen and we're all doing a great job. And it takes that weight off. Whereas if we'd gone somewhere else, because we could be anywhere, right? We could be in any of Engage's many, many wonderful environments. We could be in outer space. it gets a little harder for us to figure out what's happening. So sometimes we want that. We want that fantastical nature. And sometimes we want it to be something that taps into our sort of everyday understanding of a place. We wanted to do some studies looking at how space changes cognitive load, how it changes our ability to learn. And we dug into the literature to see if we could find just some. I just thought, oh, we'll just find a simple measurement of physical fidelity, and we'll just use that, and we can use it as a manipulation check. And this image is supposed to represent one of our undergraduate research assistants, Clarice, who I sent off on this like fact-finding mission, and she came back and was like, there's nothing. I can't find it. Maybe we're doing it wrong. And it turned out that on the computer science, HCI engineering side, lots of people were measuring physical fidelity as immersion. And it's not the same. We could be immersed in a space that has no fidelity to anything that we've ever seen before, or presence, like just feeling like we're here, but again, not quite the same. And so we went through and we did, a full measurement study, validation, replicating it in multiple samples to be able to have this kind of measure. And so I think that's one place where the social sciences do need to pick up. But the more that we can, build out the tools that we need for proper social science and social VR, the better off we will be. And that's sort of the scale. That's kind of a wall of numbers, but a quick kind of 5-item measures. So that's the first step. And then ideally, right, once we get past the nuts and bolts of how social science approaches this kind of space, we can provide insight into how we might use VR as a communication channel in the future. And I come from interpersonal communication, and I come from a very specific kind of theoretical background in interpersonal communication. And so lots of people hear interpersonal and they go, oh, two people talking to each other, automatically it's interpersonal. But we think about interpersonal communication as part of a developmental process. So every time I'm communicating to someone, I'm learning something a little bit more about them. And I hopefully will remember some of that and then be able to use that to think through what's the right way to communicate to you in the future. And we're sort of constantly developing the relationship. So then when I think about how we'll get to this one in a second. When I think about how people communicate, right, this is a very basic Shannon and Weaver cybernetics communication model. It's more than just putting senders and receivers next to each other, right? And going, okay, communicate, done. And you see company after company after company attempting this, right? If we build it, they will come. And people come and they show up and they go, okay, now what? Because just putting two people together in a room is not enough to inspire them to try to develop relationships the way that we might, it's not picking up on the things that we might try if we really did want people to develop relationships. And then when we add in VR, it gets even more complicated. Because if I think about how am I going to do a study, how am I going to think about communication processes in VR, right? Here's, transmitter, sender, noise, great. Here I've got all of my, on both sides, all of my sender things, right? What are my goals here? What's my motivation? How am I presenting my identity? How does this influence my sense of self? We've got all of the things that are in the hardware, right? The display, the degrees of not freedom, how far you can see, the sound. We've already played with the sound a little bit today. Is it comfortable? Are you plugged into the wall like I am right now? What's the processing speed? And then we've got the software, the spaces we're in, and then your avatar choices about who you are communicating. And of course, Ready Player One, me is already, sort of a defunct software as well. But that means there's many, 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 many variables that we have to think about and how people are sort of pushing through those variables in order to create relationships, communication, messages, and have meaningful interactions. And as we think through how these things happen, a lot of times when people study technology, or when technology research gets picked up in sort of the popular media, there's this idea that it's going to alter, this sort of third one, right? It will automatically alter communication processes in a fundamental way. And that might be true, but I think more often we see technology do better when it hooks into the heuristics, once again, heuristics, that we already have, right? So how can technology accommodate uh, you know, motivations and functions that we already have, right? Do you want to have a meeting space and we want to get, sort of above and beyond geographical proximity like XR Women does? Then we're looking for technology that accommodates things that we already do and motivations that we already have. How might it amplify particular processes or attenuate, right? So do the and so we just think Jesse Fox and I think that it's really important to keep this idea of not everything is like a fundamental alteration of the human experience just because it's a new technology. We need to think about this kind of accommodation and amplification as well. And so I think that, we have a lot to offer in the social sciences that doesn't always get picked up. I think a basic too fast. I think a basic one is social penetration theory, right? Altman and Taylor, that when we meet people, we want to have a small, casual interaction, right? A quick little networking small talk. And then we'll grow into like a bigger, deeper relationship. And so if you sort of expect people to jump into social VR and have sort of deep conversations right away, that's probably not going to happen. And you're going to need repeated interactions to make social spaces actually function as the kind of third places they might be. We need to think about uncertainty reduction in management. I think he's gone now, right? But we had a kind of a bot, weird individual in here earlier today. And Karen and I were doing some uncertainty reduction, right? Like, who are you? What are you doing? Why are you not talking to us? Why did you turn into a skeleton? And so it made us kind of uneasy because that's what uncertainty does. But when we have opportunities to talk to each other, to say like, oh, where are you from? What are we doing? Those choices that can be built into the VR system in some ways allow us to reduce uncertainty, which makes us feel more comfortable about the interaction we have and more satisfied. We probably need to think about, need fulfillment. We need to think about, are we doing task things or social things? And most of the research in this sort of area suggests that people are happiest when they're doing both, right? We will engage in a social interaction if there's a task involved. And when we're doing our tasks, we like there to be a bit of a social interaction going with it. And so it's not just like, oh, here's the spaces we need to do specific tasks, and here's the spaces we need, to just be social. So we need to sort of blend together the reasons that people might engage in VR spaces. Certainly issues, as relate to avatars of identity formation, impression management are important. And then I keep coming back to a theory called social information processing theory, which was really written for, text-based CMC, computer-mediated communication kinds of messaging. But what it really got right, so it's like written in 1996, so it wasn't really thinking about social VR the way we could do now, but it really got right was the way that we fill in the blanks about the information that we don't have, right? So we can form full relationships with people based on text-based interactions, right? So old school message boards that Robin and I were just talking about. You can absolutely have relationships there because you fill in a lot of the information you need to form the relationship. And I think in social VR, an important question is, what information do you get? Do you have? And what information are you missing? And in what ways do people choose to kind of fill in those blanks? And then the sort of biggest theoretical perspective that I tend to work from is the idea of affordances. And so we think a lot about features in technology, right? Like it has this feature, the user can do this, etc. But I think a lot about what does the user perceive that they're able to do, and what ways do they potentially interact with that technology. And so it's this possibilities for use is really an affordance. So an affordance is never a feature, it's never an outcome. It's more, what do you perceive is possible with a particular technology? And when we think through affordances, again, you're seeing Jesse Fox and I have done a bunch of work in this area, but when we thought about social media affordances, we thought it was really important for scholars to think about the affordances and the possibilities for action in a space rather than studying a specific platform. Because platforms change, right? A study of Facebook in 2009 is not the same as a study of Facebook in 2026. But you can think about what affordances are there now and what affordances were there then, and that's where we get to the sort of extrapolation and generalizations that we can make about technology. And so I think this is an important perspective to bring into social VR, because in social VR, it's, all the spaces will change, right? We can all name like a dozen defunct VR and XR spaces and technologies already, but the affordances of a particular space may translate from place to place to place. And so we don't have to lose all of our knowledge just because we lost a particular setting. I also think that, affordances help us to bridge from theory to design. And so I know this is very tiny and you can't see it, but you don't really just imagine that there's a chart here. And this is sort of a project students worked on to think through the affordances of a space and then what the space could look like. And so it's intended to be a classroom. So if you want a classroom, that's a Unity designed classroom. It looks exactly like one of our University of Toronto classrooms. But actually, all of these spaces are classrooms. They just range from being like very high on fidelity to very high abstraction. They all have the same affordances within them. There's a space to sit. There's a space to, engage in groups. There's displayability. There's a speaker space. And so it's sort of grounding in affordances both helps you to sort of stay structured, but allow your imagination to wander in creating these kinds of spaces, because you create the function, but the function can look like anything in VR, which is really quite exciting. And then that, I think, is where we're going to sort of inform adoption. This is not specific to VR. This is Rogers' standard S-curve. But what happens in VR, I think over and over again, if we look at that sort of blue line, is we have innovators. Hi, you're here. You're all innovators. And early adopters. Okay, a couple of you might be, early adopters. And then as VR tries to get to the early majority, it doesn't make money fast enough, or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, in terms of market share fast enough. And so the company crushes it, right? And so you've bought into a particular software, a particular platform, a particular way of coding, and now you're right back at square one with having to be an innovator. So we keep kind of murdering our early adopters over and over again. And you get this very slow diffusion of VR. And part of it is because a new technology, and not to say that VR is necessarily new, right? The origins of VR are precursor to the origins of the internet. They just sort of support each other. But to get people to use a technology like this, it's going to have many, many use cases. Obviously, games has been the big use case for VR, but you can only capture so much of a market with that particular use case. And why do people choose to use a new technology? Well, if we're the innovators and the early adopters, there's a piece of us that we use the new technology because it's there and it's cool and it's shiny, right? And we're like, ooh, what could this do? But for the other folks, for the early majority that you really need to get to hit that, tipping point in the S-curve, they have to have a use for it. And, use cases arise when the affordances of a technology allow for uses that are unavailable in previous technologies. And so I think about this quote sometime, and I'm going to critique Dave here a little bit, but he's actually a really great scholar. And so I've got a little plug for his book there in analytic activism. But he wrote this Wired article in 2021 about VR, and he's like, look, the headsets are spiffier and the games are more lucrative, but we just maybe don't want it. Maybe people don't want this. And I think that there's maybe some truth to that, but I also think that a piece of it is that we haven't actually sorted out all of the technical problems, and we certainly haven't sorted out all of the social problems. So there's still room for improvement, and there's still room for research, which is great. And so if we think about why people would use a technology, as I was saying, you get into this sort of theory of the niche, right? The social norms and structural components of a medium influence the niche. And so if you have a technology that already does what you do and you're familiar with it, you're not going to choose that, right? And so if you think about social VR, there's this underlying question of why would you choose social VR, which includes extra friction, which includes having to get into a headset, which includes maybe not being able to see nonverbal information, instead of just like popping on a Zoom, which has gotten fairly frictionless, and you can see people's faces, right? What would drive people into VR is an interesting research question. And so channels have different constellations of affordances, as we talked about. And when we get into specific affordances, so I want to be clear, this is the study I'm talking about is from Cummings and Ingber, 2024. But the measure that they were using is actually the Fox and McEwan measure of affordances in social media. So we were delighted that they took our measure and they sampled, I want to say like 700 VR users. So people who said they were social VR users and that they not only were social VR users, but that they used it at least once a month, which is a pretty high rate for most people. Maybe not XR women if you're, getting in once a week. But I have a suspicion, this is important, that most of the sample are specifically VR chat users, because I think that's a particular kind of user that has a particular perception of these affordances. So kind of keep that in mind. And so now you see all these circles and stars up here in these different affordances. And so on one hand, the circles all indicate affordances that we saw in social media that people also saw as being highly present in social VR. So it was a 1 to 7 scale. Anything that's circled is scored above a 5. And so you have things that make sense, like social presence, right? That's one of the you get that in VR research, and you hear it from, sort of the VR hype all the time, that the VR has immersion and it has presence. And social presence will be the reason we all want to sort of be together in these spaces. So it does have that at a pretty high level. There's some that surprise me, like bandwidth. So bandwidth is about the nonverbal cues that are shared between communicators. It sort of surprised me that they said that there was a high amount of nonverbal cues, because often there's not, right? It's actually a little bit tricky to lecture in a space like Engage, because you're not getting, the eye contact and the sort of visual representations of listening that you might see in a physical space. But VR chat users thought that there was high bandwidth. You do get a lot of vocalics though, right? If someone's got sort of a dynamic speaking voice, you can pick that out. And then, so another one that I thought was a little odd was network association, which is about you can see all the other people in the network. But I thought, again, Oculus users, VR chat users, it pops up. Like my screen today was like, Karen Alexander is in VR. I'm like, she better be. We're meeting in 2 minutes, right? So you can sort of see those things in a way that maybe you couldn't see in a physical space. So then these stars, I'm trying to remember which is which. I believe if it has a red star, then the social VR was thought to have this particular affordance at a higher amount than face-to-face. And the bigger the star, this is not exactly statistically significant, but it works, right? The bigger the star, the bigger that difference was. And if it's thought to have, or if it has a blue star, then it's thought to have that particular affordance at a higher level than video conferencing. And again, the bigger the star, the bigger the difference. And so when we start to look at this, like to find a niche for why people would use social VR, social presence is not the thing. Like, yeah, VR has it, but no better than the other channels. And bandwidth is not the thing, but anonymity is. And that's sort of very interesting because a lot of the use cases companies are trying to sell, education, training, meetings like this where we don't want to be anonymous, anonymity is not the affordance that they're providing. And so just a little, food for thought there. But we also thought about, what about social VR affordances that are not social media affordances, right? Like you can take the perceived social communication channel scale and apply it to VR, but VR has things that we didn't think about when we were thinking about just in social media. So we've done some work in my lab. Those are not participants. Those are students who have agreed to be in this picture. I think that is Engage in the background. And so we put them in Engage. They did a 20-minute VR experience, the participants, a social interaction, and then we did a post-experience interview. So like really good social science methods of actually a qualitative study, even though a lot of the participants thought they were in an experiment. There was no experimental design there. And what we found was actually our participants did like anonymity. We bring them into the lab. They are on different sides of the door. They don't see each other. And so they're like, I have difficulty talking to people, but I found it easy to do in VR because I couldn't see them. For our sort of, 18 or 19-year-old participants who are like, I don't want to talk to other people. We're like, oh, I could do it in VR because they can only see my avatar. And so that seemed better. They talked about bandwidth, but mainly in the fact that there wasn't bandwidth. So in some ways they liked it, right? I appreciated not having to keep up with facial expressions and body language. Like I only had one channel to worry about. I liked that. And then we had other participants who were like, I wanted a little bit more, right? I wanted some back channels. I wanted some of that confirmation about what people were talking about. And I wished that there was more bandwidth. I mean, they didn't say bandwidth, exactly, but that's how we coded it out. We also had participants talk about haptic feedback, right? They wanted physical or other sensory feedback. And they were like, I would have loved to have the sensory feeling. They didn't like when they had to use the tablet. They had to put your hand through the tablet. They want that feedback mechanism. They didn't love that you couldn't really touch the other person to show them something. And but then we also got this person who was like, at the end we high-fived and we could feel the vibration. And at the time, at least, I think now even, Engage didn't really do that. So they just got some like interesting haptic feedback and assigned this meaning to it that was not designed into the actual setting. And then they talked about embodiment. So again, kind of a new affordance, right? That you can be embodied. But they said, their hand was drawing, but it wasn't moving. And so I wanted to be able to see that, and things got a little off and they weren't synchronized right. I think one example of this is I always find these little thumbtack chairs that we have here kind of weird. I like watching presentations from them, but it does look a little weird when we're all like just laying here like this, like I'm sunbathing and watching a presentation. And so it's because it's kind of a weird sort of embodiment slippage issue. And so over and over again in the affordances we were finding was that they were salient to the user, but they weren't functional. And I think this also speaks to adoption issues, that if you have this kind of, a wild, vivid imagination of what VR could be and that it could be anything, and you're going to get to be you in this physical setting, physical digital setting, but then you get in and there's all these things you can't do. Well, that's very frustrating to a communicator. And even when we go, but oh my gosh, you can do so much more than you could do even 5 years ago. It's come so far. They're like, well, great, but it's not, it's not necessarily worth the friction if I also can't do all of these other things. And so I think we have to think through, the potentials of social science in helping us to create better experiences and to create better content and to think through, how the industry might adapt to the way that people actually want to communicate in these spaces. And so social science should help us with, processual understanding of social VR. You can't just throw people in a space and be like, talk, and then, and then it works, right? There are all of these communication processes that we want to sort of nudge along in different ways. It'll give us a better understanding of how people make sense of virtual environments. The inclusion of perceptual variables will help us create new stimuli and experience, because the flip is also true. I think that social VR can help us to understand our social science processes better as well, because we can so easily manipulate the environment and other variables that are not manipulatable, are not able to be manipulated in the physical world. And so hopefully we'll inform the development of social VR to incorporate these processes and affordances and consider meaning making across the channels, not just use, not just like, oh, I use social VR, but like, how do you make meaning with other people within those particular spaces? But I think we also have some things to think about on the social science side. It's very interdisciplinary, this area, and the Questioning Reality Conference takes advantage of that. So I love the interdisciplinarity nature of it. I love sitting down with a software engineer and being like, what can you make? And then I'm like, what will people do with it? But I say sometimes to be interdisciplinary is to be undisciplined. And so it makes it very difficult to follow how people use different terms and concepts across a total literature. We have issues with sample size and quality, and guilty as charged, right? So cell sizes, meaning, if we're doing comparisons, like how many people we have in each group, can be very low in HCI research because it can be very hard to get that amount of people into the lab. I was just saying to someone yesterday that my lab, it clicks along for 12 weeks out of the year, 6 weeks in the fall and 6 weeks in the winter. We are full blast collecting all the data we possibly can, because then the students go away for the summer and not around, and it's hard to collect community samples, and it's hard to get people to come into the lab to be part of a study. And so that's just sort of a challenge that we have to think about and how to work around. And then, as Karen was mentioning, I do quite a bit of work in replication. We're working on a revision of our on replication article that we wrote about 10 years ago. And being able to replicate results study, that's really important for the social sciences. Otherwise, we don't have a lot of confidence in those results. But there's so many technical pieces in VR, it makes it very difficult. So if I've done a study in Engage, does that transfer if somebody does that same study in VR chat? What if you did a study in AltSpace? Can you replicate it, right? And so those things and the sort of constant churn of the industry gets into sort of our fundamental social science processes well, in a way that I think then again makes it important to think about, okay, what were the affordances of the space, and what was the actual effects and the theory behind what we expected to go on, even more important, because the spaces can change so quickly and make replication difficult. So I'm 5 minutes under. Great. But that I'm hoping that you might have some questions, and I've got time set aside to stay around for those questions.
Sorry about that. Just trying to get myself unmuted, and I did turn off the 3D voice so that folks can ask questions from the audience. I think this is really fascinating stuff, and I think that everyone here will relate to it in some way or another. because we do come together in social VR and we use it. And I was thinking as you were talking, for me, one of the things that I find that I do in VR is use exaggerated expressions, like, more hand movements than I would in real life, or, if I'm nodding my head, it's like very vigorously. And another thing that struck me, I used to talk about this in a, like a 3D and 2D platform where, sort of the movement and your physical proximity to other people, I think, is meaningful. Like for me, deciding where to sit. Who do I sit next to? The person who's here for the first time, or the person who, hasn't been here for a long time. To kind of make them feel welcome or comfortable. Just little things like that. I think are worth considering, but I am sure that some people here in the audience have questions, and you should be able to unmute yourselves, or I will call on you if you want to use your raised hand function. Who has a question?
I have a question. Shall I just go?
Sure, Sarah,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Oh, great. Thanks. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Just so fascinating. I'm working with a population that has a lot of trauma, and situational awareness is something that I think can make VR not feel optional to them. And I'm wondering, have you done any research on how important situational awareness is in relationship to the physical world? And how do you work with that when you're working with a high trauma population? Thanks so much.
So I don't specifically work with high trauma populations. And then I have another question for you. Because of the interdisciplinary nature of all of this, can you tell me how you define situational awareness?
Someone who feels like they need to be in complete control of their physical world at times to feel safe.
Yeah. So, like I said, I don't work specifically with high trauma populations that we know of. That's actually another issue of, like, are we collecting enough control variable? We've been thinking about this a lot in terms of neurodivergence and making sure that we're sort of capturing the neurodivergent levels of the populations that we're using. But, something like situational awareness, that could lead to, a series of kind of interesting studies of, is it helpful for folks to feel like they have, control over a VR setting because they know what it's going to be, or perhaps they've designed it, and the more control you could give them over the space, would they feel more comfortable? Like, I could certainly see an interesting line of research there. It's just not something that my particular lab has engaged with at the moment.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, who else has a question? Miji, you look like you're ready to ask something. Yes.
Hello, is my mic on?
Hi. Yep.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So interesting presentation. Thank you. So I have a studio where we develop educational and cultural applications, so VR and MR. And I saw some of your pictures of the classroom, abstract places, and physical fidelity. Do you have any research done on physical spaces where, let's say, you have a classroom and then it's for a, let's say, knowledge acquisition point of view, was it more effective for students to absorb knowledge in the class setting, or maybe in abstract form where the physical fidelity is low?
So I love that you picked right up on the actual study we're doing with that.
Oh, okay.
So that's why we started looking around for this physical fidelity measure, because we wanted to see, if people perceived it the way we thought we had designed it, because the actual set of studies that we're working on is putting people in those stimuli, giving them a learning activity, and then they take a test at the end. And we're just now starting to sift through the data from that particular study. We got variation in the environment, so that's good. But we're still putting together the scores from the tests that they took. But the hypothesis there is that it should. And we think we're using fidelity as a kind of proxy for the amount of cognitive load that the environment is introducing. We think that for the sort of rote learning, didactic learning process that we gave them in that study, they should do better if they're in the classroom versus if they're in, the lily pads or the weird honey bear world, which the students came up with. And I was like, I need something weird. And they're like, how's this? And I was like, golf carts and honey bears. Sure. Okay. And then we're doing a second study. We've collected some of the data in the spring and we'll be collecting more in the fall, where now instead of having them just like come in, see the video, in VR, watch, take a test, we have them come in and do a collaborative activity. The whole thing's about climate change. And so we're in Canada, so it still can be. And so they do an activity, about how to solve this particular climate change problem with another student and do a little presentation. And then we're going to take all these presentations. It's going to take forever, but we're going to take all these presentations and we're going to sort of code them for levels of collaboration and creativity. And what we're wondering is, do people get more creative when they're in the weirder, odder space? And so we kind of think, in terms of learning, it's going to depend on how we define learning. But it's sort of both different kinds of learning may be more adaptable to different VR spaces. And this came out of, I teach in a lot of VR spaces. We've used Engage. And there's this question of like, do you put them in the lecture hall or do you put them in, the Stonehenge space? And Jeremy Bailenson lab in Stanford has some work on this as well. You get some different effects when they're out in sort of the, the outdoors, but in VR, than you get in sort of physical classroom spaces. But we think that there's, maybe sometimes reasons to reduce cognitive load. Like, let's give you seats and a stage so you know what's happening here, so we're not all like running around. But that there's also some benefits for it being sort of really kind of wild and creative. And we're just now sifting through the data that we've collected over the last year. And hopefully I'll have some interesting results for you all in the future.
Thank you. Actually, we are developing Korean learning language acquisition, and so if we can see if placing a user in that kind of environment will be more effective. So the environment has to be more relevant to the content in there, and then we would like to see. And we are also developing, we are in Canada as well, and I'm close to Toronto, and we are doing collaborative work with actually Scarborough campus on STEM programs, and then it's about climate change. So it'd be really great if we can share more information later on.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily, and that's probably the best way to grab my attention. But no, it definitely sounds like we're working in some similar veins. And so that, that question of the sort of contextual relevance of the space is a little bit different than what we're thinking about with fidelity, but I think another important variable. And also there's a bit, like, yeah, of course, like why wouldn't you want to learn Korean in a Korean, palace versus, a UT Scarborough classroom?
Question? Yes,
Elizabeth?
I'm interested in the age variable and social VR for older adults who've lost the ability to drive to their usual social venues.
So again, most of the samples that we've worked with in my lab are younger. However, I have got a great colleague at University of Waterloo. His name is Cosmin Montanou, and he's been doing a lot of work on technology and aging, and particularly VR. And he has this whole argument, that we can't take a deficit model with older adults, and when you sort of give them access to these tools, that they really do love it. And I think that could be like a really fruitful area of study, is what helps them adopt the technology, right? Because there's that friction level of getting into it. There are, some there can be some like visual aspects, or people think like, oh, it's, I'm just going to make me sick. Then maybe they won't do it, even though we know cyber sickness has gotten a lot better. But that would be, again, like a really fruitful, fascinating area to study. And the way that I start to think about it is like, okay, what are the variables? What's the friction for them? What's their ability to use the technology? How well can they sort of, without that, gamer background, how well can they sort of map the controls? Are the controls, shown to them, so that way they can get through all these friction pieces, and then they can have these sort of fruitful interactions with folks, even though maybe they're housebound or it's more difficult to leave, especially in Canada in the wintertime, right? It gets icy. Maybe it's better to be at home in a VR setting, engaging with people.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, I'm aware of the fact that we are a little bit over our scheduled time, and so I'd like to give Robin the opportunity to bring the recording to a close, and for us to thank Bree. If you're willing to stay on a few more minutes in case there are any more questions, we'd be grateful. But let's all give a warm round of applause in whatever way we can for Bree. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. It's fascinating work, and I'm so glad you're doing it, and we look forward to more and more because it's a really rich field of study. So thank you so much for coming today and sharing your work with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And like in the field, I think you may not know this, but XR Women is known as a group that's really pulling it off, right? In terms of having social meetings, getting people engaged. But I know how much work is happening in the background to make these things that seem serendipitous just happen, and that you all are really like putting in the work to making these spaces meaningful for people.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Okay, great. Well, that officially brings our event to a close. I know people have things they need to get onto in their days, and Bree, you may as well. But this was great. This was awesome.